Scar wasn't even close to being the strongest lion in the Pride Lands, yet he still managed to become the king after killing Mufasa and almost killing his heir and son Simba. Not only was he the king, but the dastardly lion showed that he was capable of ruling with an iron paw without anyone questioning him. But what about all of the lionesses that were a part of the Pride? You would think that they would have just banded together to overthrow their unjust ruler before they ever let him destroy the Pride Lands, but for some reason, they didn't. Well, after rewatching the movie, along with as many of the other retellings of The Lion King as possible, the shocking truth behind their obedience is pretty clear. When Scar returned to the Pride Lands from the gorge on the day of that fatal wildebeest stampede, the news he delivered to the lionesses gave them very few options for what they could do next. They could rise up against their new king, they could run away from their generational home and leave the Pride Lands behind, or they could accept that they now had a new king. And Scar made that decision a little easier for the lionesses when he fudged the truth about how Mufasa died. Instead of being honest and being like, "Hey guys, I just killed my brother and now I'm the king," he blamed Mufasa's death on a supposedly random stampede. To make matters worse, Scar also lied about Simba and said that the young prince was killed as well, when in reality the cub escaped his wrath and narrowly survived being hunted down by the hyenas before being run out of the Pride Lands. When you think about it though, it's pretty clear why Scar lied, aside from the fact that he was the villain. If Scar had walked into the Pride Lands and openly admitted to killing their king, the lionesses, especially Sarabi, would not have stood idly by. They would have risen up and avenged Mufasa or died trying, which would have made for a very short movie. So when Scar returned and explained to Sarabi and the rest of the Pride that Mufasa was dead, he admitted the full truth and claimed what he believed was his rightful spot at the top of the Pride, and that left the lionesses with the three options. In the movie, they clearly chose not to fight, at least not until Simba returned to Pride Rock, and we also know they didn't run away from the Pride Lands. The lionesses made their final choice, which was to submit and accept that Scar was their king now. But what exactly made it so easy for Sarabi and her pride to accept and obey their new leader? Well, it's important to note that just because Sarabi and the others allowed Scar to become their king without resistance or physical violence, it wasn't as if they were happy about it. In the original movie, the live-action remake, and even the Broadway musical, all of the lionesses that were shown in the Pride Lands after Scar took over seemed much more dreary and forlorn than when Mufasa was their king, clearly showing that most, if not all, of the lionesses were reluctant to follow Scar to become the king, but at the end of the day, they had very little to say in the matter. You see, unlike how lions act in the real world, the Pride in the Lion King seemed to go by what's known as a hereditary monarchy, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a monarchy where the next ruler is predetermined and is typically the male child of the current ruler. That's why Mufasa tried to teach Simba how to be a proper leader from such a young age, because he knew that when his time came, the Pride Lands were supposed to be Simba's responsibility. Now, in real life, that's not quite how it works with lions. Instead of specifically choosing their king based on who their father was, the leader of the Pride is determined by simple strength and size. Whichever male lion within the Pride is the most dominant is the one that's in charge. Luckily for Scar, though, he didn't have to concern himself with any of that, because up until Simba was born, he was next in line after Mufasa to take over. And since Scar told everyone that both Mufasa and Simba were tragically killed before he could get to the gorge and save them, he was the only option that the Pride had left. Now, it goes without saying that the lionesses most likely knew that there was something fishy about Scar's story, considering how much he had to gain from Mufasa's death, but really there was nothing they could do. Without the rightful heir around, Scar was officially the king of Pride Rock, which begs the question, why didn't they just leave when Scar started ruling and ruining the Pride Lands? To answer that, you need to remember that the Pride Lands was Sarabi, Nala, and all the other lionesses' generational home, which means there was a massive sentimental factor at play. And even though that was never directly mentioned in the original film, it's something that was touched on in both the Broadway and the live-action adaptations. In the musical, there's actually a song that's performed by Nala named Shadowland, which was based on a song from a Lion King-inspired concept album. In Shadowland, the opening line is sung in Zulu and roughly translates to "The land of our ancestors is holy," in reference to the Pride Lands, showing that it isn't just some random place that they would all be willing to leave. However, you can tell that the lionesses had at least considered it, because throughout the song, Nala was essentially seeking permission to leave the Pride Lands to find more fertile land that they could relocate to. Although she does get permission, Shadowland does a great job conveying the emotions felt within the Pride about how important their ancestral home was to them. And when you think about it, Nala didn't spend nearly as much time as the rest of the lions living in the Pride Lands while it was in its prime. This means the only reason that she was more willing to leave and search for new land than the rest of the Pride was because she didn't have quite as much sentimental attachment to it as they all did. Even without the added song from the play, though, it just makes sense that the lions would feel a strong attachment to the Pride Lands. They were all most likely born there, and most of them had children there as well, meaning that Pride Rock was their refuge, and no matter how bad things got, they refused to abandon it. And things got pretty bad. At the beginning of the movie, the Pride Lands was a lush and abundant landscape that was filled with wildlife and biodiversity. But by the end of it, the lands had been so overhunted by the scavenging hyenas that it had become just as dark and barren as the hyenas' old home in the elephant graveyard. Now, if they loved their home so much that they couldn't bear to leave it, how could they just sit by and watch as Scar and his hyena army turned it into a desolate wasteland? Well, you have to remember that Scar did his best to make sure that his new loyal subjects remained that way. His first act as the king was to allow his army of hyenas back into the Pride Lands, which gave him the numbers that he needed to assure that nobody could turn against him. And as you might remember, there were only a handful of lionesses left at Pride Rock. Meanwhile, there were literally countless hyenas that were all under Scar's command. And what did he command them to do? He told them to guard the pride. He made sure that his brainless but blindly loyal servants would keep a constant eye on the rest of the lions to ensure that there was no funny business going on. And of course, there was one lioness that was singled out above the rest. Sarabi was the one lioness that Scar had to be absolutely sure couldn't revolt against him. He knew that all of the other lionesses looked up to her, considering the fact that she was their former queen and leader of the hunt. But even if Sarabi wanted to inspire some sort of uprising, without the proper will to fight back, the lions would have just become hyena food. There were too many of the little laughing scavengers for them to take on all by themselves. So for a while, it was simply the smart move for Sarabi and the rest of their pride to lay low and accept Scar as their new king. So then what would it take for the lionesses to be able to actually properly fight back? The truth, of course. Once the truth came out about what really happened to Mufasa and Simba, it was all over for Scar. The lionesses fought back even though the odds were greatly stacked against them. They were still vastly outnumbered by the hyenas, but in the final act of The Lion King, when the truth came out about Scar killing Mufasa, the lionesses couldn't sit idly by anymore. While Simba dueled his uncle, Sarabi and the rest of the pride rose up and attacked the hyenas who had oppressed them for far too long. The fight was epic no matter which version of The Lion King you refer to, and it always ends the same way. With Simba defeating Scar, the lionesses pushed back the hyenas and secured Pride Rock for themselves and their families once again. As you saw by the very end of the movie, Pride Rock and the land around it had gone back to being the lush landscape that Simba and Nala once knew it as. It was back to being the pride's ancestral home again, and to make things even more special, it was once again fit to raise a new generation of lions. And that, of course, includes the next generation of rulers, with Simba and Nala introducing a child of their own into the world. It was almost as if Scar had never ruled with tyranny over the land in the first place. What do you think, though? If the lionesses had tried to overthrow Scar when he first returned to the Pride Lands, claiming to be the new king, would anything have changed? Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments below.